What's up, biology students? Mr. Holloway here. In today's video, we're going to talk about how the process of evolution can produce new species over time, a phenomenon called speciation. When a new species is formed, we call that speciation. And according to Charles Darwin, new species originate by means of natural selection. That's basically the title of his famous book. So the same process that causes species to change over generations can, if allowed to go on long enough, eventually produce new species. But what exactly is a species? What are our criteria for deciding and drawing the line between one species and the next? A species, in the general sense, is a specific kind of organism. For example, the common sunflower is a specific kind of flower, the African lion is a specific kind of cat, and the grizzly bear is a specific kind of bear. This system was invented in 1735 by a Swedish botanist named Carolus Linnaeus. Linnaeus wrote a book called Systema Naturae, in which he attempted to classify all of the different kinds of plants and animals living on planet Earth. This book established a system for naming and classifying living organisms into categories that humans still use today. We've had to make some changes to his original classifications, though, to account for what we've learned about evolution, which wasn't really a thing in Linnaeus's day. Linnaeus recommended classifying organisms into different categories, and these categories come in different levels, from very broad to very specific. This figure shows us an example of how that works. All these organisms are animals, but only these organisms are chordates. Of those, only these animals are mammals, and only these animals are carnivores. As you can see, we're getting more and more specific as we go down these levels. These animals are all bears, and these two are true bears, members of the genus Ursus. This specific kind of true bear is a grizzly bear, named Ursus arctos for its genus and species. And we would write this name like this, with the genus capitalized and the species in lowercase. Typically, we also write these names in italics. Not totally sure why. There are actually several competing definitions of what exactly constitutes a species, but it is generally accepted that members of the same species are able to breed and produce fertile offspring who themselves are able to breed. Different species, even within the same genus, are usually not able to breed in a manner that produces fertile offspring. This idea is called the biological species concept, and it is the most commonly accepted definition of what makes a species. For example, horses and donkeys are different species. They are able to breed, but their offspring, animals that we call mules, are sterile and are unable to breed themselves. Mules are an evolutionary dead end because two mules cannot mate to produce another mule. Populations are groups made of members of the same species living together in the same area. In our figure, you can see that we've got two species of birds, the gray and the blue, and each species is divided up into several populations. Most species are made up of multiple populations, but some do exist as only a single population located in only one part of the world. Because individuals within a population are able to mate with one another, we say that they are all part of the same gene pool. Populations, remember, are the unit of evolution. Individual organisms don't evolve, but populations of organisms do. Speciation, or the formation of a new species, can happen under a variety of conditions. The most common forms of speciation are allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is when speciation occurs due to a physical barrier that separates part of the population from the rest of the population. In this case, a river has divided our population of trees. Differences in environmental conditions on each side of the river, even very subtle differences, result in different selective pressures that push the evolutionary process in different directions. Since natural selection would favor slightly different traits and abilities in each of these environments, trees in these two environments would evolve differently and evolve to become separate species over time. Sympatric speciation is when speciation occurs within a population, without any kind of separation or barriers. In this case, a new species of tree has evolved right in the middle of the old species. Usually, this kind of speciation occurs when two very different sets of traits each hold a survival advantage. In this case, perhaps trees that grow taller and narrower have high fitness, and trees that grow shorter and wider also have high fitness, while trees that are somewhere in between have lower fitness. Over time, natural selection could cause a divergence from one population and one species into two populations and two species living side by side, one species of tall, narrow trees and one species of short, wide trees. Whether we're talking about allopatric or sympatric speciation, one thing must happen first in order for speciation to occur: reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is when there is no longer any interbreeding between members of two populations. This means that the gene pools of these two populations are also isolated, and no genes are moving back and forth between populations any longer. In allopatric speciation, this would occur primarily due to the geographic barrier that prevents individuals from one population from being able to reach individuals from the other population. In the past, all these individuals used to be able to interbreed, and genes were passed around through sexual reproduction. That's what it means to be part of the same gene pool. However, after this barrier split the population, these two new populations couldn't interbreed any longer simply because they couldn't get to one another. Now, these two populations have separate gene pools, and over time, isolated gene pools diverge into new and separate species. Anything that prevents individuals from different populations from mating with one another and producing offspring together is called an isolating mechanism. There are a bunch of different ways that populations can be reproductively isolated from one another. The obvious example is the one we already talked about, geographic isolation. In this case, some kind of barrier prevents the members of two populations from interbreeding, something like a river, a mountain range, a desert, or something like that. This is typically how allopatric speciation occurs. But there are other ways for groups of individuals to become reproductively isolated from one another, even if they live in close proximity, and this can lead to sympatric speciation. Consider a population of lizards, for example, in which some individuals prefer to live and hunt in trees, while other individuals prefer to live and hunt on the ground. Lizards living and hunting in trees would rarely, if ever, encounter a lizard living on the ground, and consequently, these lizards would never interbreed and would be reproductively isolated from one another, even if they lived together in the same population. Or consider a population of flowers, where some individuals reproduce in spring and others reproduce in the summer. They would never interbreed. Or what about a population of frogs, in which some individuals prefer to reproduce at dusk, while others prefer to reproduce at dawn? These two groups would never interbreed. The point is, there are a lot of factors that could keep some members of a population from mating with other members, and if groups aren't sharing genes via reproduction, if they aren't part of the same gene pool, then they can evolve in totally different directions. Then there's the interesting case of the mule that we just talked about a minute ago. A mule is the offspring of a mating between a horse and a donkey, and although these two different species can produce babies together, these babies, the mules, cannot themselves breed, and since there is no way for a mule to ever give birth to another mule, this is a kind of isolating mechanism as well. Let's talk about some squirrels, specifically the kaibab squirrel and the Abert squirrel. The Abert squirrel lives in environments ranging from Colorado to New Mexico to Arizona, but their population stops at the south rim of the Grand Canyon, right here on the map. On the north rim of the Grand Canyon, there is a population of squirrels that looks very similar to the Abert squirrel in many ways. It has dark-colored fur and these cool little tufted ears. This is the kaibab squirrel, and it is currently classified as a subspecies of Abert squirrel. This means that it is very likely that these two kinds of squirrels would be able to reproduce and make fertile offspring. But these two groups are reproductively isolated from one another by the vast expanse that is the Grand Canyon. The environmental conditions on the north rim of the Grand Canyon are pretty different from those on the south rim, and that means that these two groups are subject to different selective pressures. Over time, this means that natural selection will cause these two groups to evolve differently, and it is likely to result in speciation at some point in the future. This would be an example of allopatric speciation, because it would occur due to a physical barrier, the Grand Canyon in this case, that geographically isolates these two groups from one another. Salamanders in California are another great example of speciation. This map shows the geographic range of several subspecies of these salamanders. The ancestor of all these different subspecies occupied the Pacific Northwest, and members of this species have been slowly moving southward for a very long time. Salamanders are amphibians, and their breathing requires their skin to stay moist and cool. So as they move southward, the salamanders stick to the mountainous regions, the coastal range here, and the Sierra Nevada mountains here, avoiding the central deserts of California. If we look at different populations of salamanders in different parts of California, we notice a sort of transition in terms of appearance as we go from north to south. We should also notice that this transition occurs differently in the coastal range compared to the Sierra Nevadas. Studies have indicated that the fitness of salamanders along the Sierra Nevadas is based largely on their ability to remain camouflaged. They avoid predators by blending in, and blending in is their primary adaptation. However, salamanders living along the coastal range, who happen to look a lot like a species of poisonous newt, are taking a different evolutionary path. Their fitness is due to mimicry. Looking like something poisonous means that predators are likely to avoid these salamanders, and unlike salamanders in the Sierra Nevadas, mimicry is the primary adaptation of these subspecies. These two lineages are still able to interbreed in places where their populations come into contact. On our map, these are referred to as zones of hybridization. However, even though mating between coastal salamanders and those living in the Sierra Nevadas is possible in a few places, and even though these two groups are able to produce viable offspring, the offspring are found to have lower fitness compared to their parents because they are not very well camouflaged and they don't look very much like the poisonous species of newt. So, these hybrids are far less likely to survive and produce offspring of their own. These subspecies are in the process of becoming reproductively isolated from one another, and separate isolated gene pools are being established. This is a key step in the process of speciation, and it is happening right now in California as we speak. Another example of speciation is a classic and extremely well-studied example, one which Darwin himself studied when he traveled to the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands, this cluster of islands here, can be found just south of the equator off the coast of Ecuador. Although they are all relatively close together, the Galapagos Islands have pretty different environmental conditions. Some islands are very wet with lush vegetation, while other islands are drier and almost desert-like in some regions. And because many of these islands are mountainous, you sometimes find very different environments on the same island, down near the shore versus up on top of the mountain. This means that each island has its own set of unique selective pressures, and natural selection will favor different traits on different islands. This is a cladogram showing the relationships among the Galapagos finches. Take a minute to look at it and see what kind of sense you can make of it. For instance, what kind of traits define these different clades within this finch family tree? And what do we suspect to be true about the common ancestor of all these birds? As you can see, we think all these finches share a pretty recent common ancestor, one who originally flew to the Galapagos from South America. You might also notice that the derived characters referenced in this cladogram all have to do with what the finches eat, which is largely determined by the size and shape of their beaks. As this population of finches became established in the Galapagos, it expanded its range and spread to new environments on new islands. These island populations were geographically isolated from one another, and therefore reproductively isolated, because finches were far more likely to mate with other finches that lived on the same island than they were to mate with finches that lived on different islands. As finches moved into new environments, different traits turned out to be useful on different islands. Some islands favored large beaks that helped to crack open the larger seeds that were available, while other islands favored smaller beaks that were better at picking up the smaller seeds that were available. Still other finches were able to get by eating insects, and this practice was made easier if those finches happened to have a slightly different beak configuration. Since these populations are reproductively isolated from one another, their gene pools began to change and diverge from one another as a result of natural selection, playing out a little differently on each one of these islands. Because they have adapted to their unique environments in different ways, these groups of finches now look and behave differently as a result. Even when they come into contact with one another, they are now unlikely to breed with one another. Over time, this has led to numerous instances of speciation, and today there are many different species of finches living in the Galapagos. This is called an adaptive radiation because the common ancestor of this group, the original finch species from South America, gave rise to many different species due to the many different adaptive pathways that turned out to be useful in the new environments found on these islands. Speciation occurs at different rates depending on how slowly or rapidly the environment changes. When the environment changes slowly but steadily over time, this produces a pattern of evolution called gradualism, characterized by a gradual but persistent pattern of change in a lineage of living organisms. As speciation occurs, one species sort of fades into the next, and it can be difficult to know where to draw the lines between one species and the next. This is a lot like what's happening with our salamanders in California. When the environment changes quickly, then remains stable for very long periods of time before changing quickly again, this produces a pattern of evolution called punctuated equilibrium, rapid bursts of evolution followed by long periods of stability and equilibrium. Both patterns of change are indicated frequently in the fossil record here on Earth. Regardless of whether it happens rapidly or very, very slowly, evolution produces biodiversity. Speciation, the evolution of a new species, occurs when populations of similar organisms diverge from one another in their evolution due to reproductive isolation and differing selective pressures. And with that, I will bring our video to a close. Thanks for watching, everyone.